Hello, welcome to Cell Reproduction Lecture video number 4. We are going to talk about sexual reproduction and meiosis in this final lecture for this chapter. Now, we are not going to be talking about the reproductive system. We will be talking about that at a later point during the school year, but this is going to be talking about sexual reproduction from a cellular level. What that means is you start with, for example, in this case, a sex cell from a male and a sex cell from a female, and they have half the number of typical chromosomes, and they come together and they unite and they form a zygote that has a mix of the DNA. All right, showing it to you over here. Sperm has 23 chromosomes and egg has 23 chromosomes. They come together, they unite, they make the zygote with 46 chromosomes. Fertilization took place, and now you have an embryo that begins to grow into a human with 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. Now, in order to half the number of chromosomes, organisms need to utilize a process called meiosis. So we're going to talk about meiosis today. Now, sexual reproduction. Why is it a good thing in nature? Well, it's a good thing in nature because it creates genetic variety, and genetic variety gives organisms an opportunity to be able to survive their elements. So genetic variety is a very, very good thing. We will be talking about evolution in a later chapter, and variety is a very important aspect of evolution. So let's begin. We're going to begin talking about sexual reproduction. Now, the process of meiosis is how a cell originally starts with, for example, in this picture, 4 chromosomes and ends with daughter cells at the very end that have half the number, 2 chromosomes in each daughter cell. So 4 became 2, all right? Now, meiosis, basically in humans, you start with 46 and you end up with daughter cells that have 23. That's what you do. What does meiosis make? Meiosis makes haploid. Well, what does haploid mean? Haploid means something that has half the number of typical chromosomes. So humans, our haploid number is 23. So meiosis makes cells, gametes, sex cells, with half the number of chromosomes that they originally have, the original cell had. So meiosis produces 23 chromosomed eggs and sperm with 23 chromosomes. That's what this means, right? There's 2 parts of meiosis. After the first part, meiosis part 1, they call it, you start with 4, you go to 2, all right? Meiosis part 2 is almost identical to mitosis, okay? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's begin. Here's meiosis part 1. In meiosis part 1 has what's called prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1, just like mitosis had all the 4 phases. They are also in meiosis, but you have a part 1, and then the cell does a part 2 of all of these phases. If you look at it, they look very, very similar with some slight deviations than mitosis, and we'll go over those deviations in a second. So here's prophase part 1, okay? In prophase part 1, it's almost just like prophase of mitosis. Let's talk about it. The nuclear membrane breaks down. The nucleolus breaks down. The chromosomes condense and become visible. The chromatin condenses and forms chromosomes. The spindle fibers start to form, and the centrosomes start having the microtubules stretch from end to end, and they start moving. All this stuff happens in prophase of mitosis. Same stuff, except a few different things occur here. If you notice here, they're paired up in groups, okay? So these are the homologous pairs. So one of these came from mom, the other one came from dad, one came from mom, one came from dad, okay? So they pair up in their homologous pairs during prophase. Them moving towards each other and pairing up, that's called synapsis. When they are paired up, it's called a tetrad. That's what a tetrad is. So they're sitting as a pair. And what's a tetrad? It is a homologous pair of chromosomes. What is a pair of chromosomes? It means you got one of the pair from mom and one from dad. Okay. Now, here's what happens here. Now, here's meiosis, why it's such a good thing. Meiosis has something occurs during prophase 1 of meiosis. It's called crossing over. And crossing over leads to this thing called genetic recombination. This is an important process because it allows when you produce those sex cells, those sperm or eggs, you will not just produce them in a normal way, you'll produce them with even more variety due to crossing over. So what happens? When they pair up as a tetrad due to synapses, sometimes they physically will cross over and swap DNA with each other. Okay, so that swapping of DNA is called crossing over. Why is it a good thing? It increases variation in DNA. Okay, now afterwards, when the genetic material has changed due to crossing over, we say that genetic recombination has taken place. The location where crossing over happens is called a chiasma, showing it to you right there, showing you they're kind of folding of each other and switching information. On the next pictures I show you, you're going to notice that the blue chromosome has a little purple on it, the purple has a little blue on it, the orange has some red on it, and this red will have a little bit of orange on it, because that'll show you that crossing over took place and genetic recombination happened. So prophase 1 is where this happens. It does not happen in the other parts of meiosis. So prophase 1 is where synapsis brings them together. They form as tetrads and crossing over takes place. Okay. Metaphase 1, they line up in the middle just like mitosis, but they're not just lined up single file like they are in mitosis. They're lined up as a tetrad, as a pair of chromosomes. All right, that's the difference. In anaphase part 1, instead of you probably remember in mitosis, chromatids separate. Well, chromatids don't separate in anaphase part 1. The full chromosomes now separate from each other in both directions. So it originally started with 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 2 move towards each side. It is now getting to the point of having half the original number and making it haploid. So it is going to be haploid after this step. And look here, it now has 2 chromosomes. It originally started with 4. After meiosis part 1, it will be haploid and have only 2 chromosomes in the resulting cells. Now, meiosis, and this is showing you part 1. Part 1 is the only part I really go over. The reason I don't go over part 2 in as much detail is part 2 of meiosis is identical to mitosis, except for one thing. You don't start with 4 chromosomes. You start with 2 chromosomes. So meiosis part 1, you have tetrads in prophase 1. You have crossing over taking place for more genetic recombination. You have tetrads in metaphase 1. And then you have chromosomes getting pulled apart. And now you have new resulting cells with half the original number. And now the cells are haploid after part 1. Part 2, identical to mitosis, except instead of starting with 4 chromosomes, it only starts with 2 chromosomes, and it's exactly like mitosis. So here they are. Okay, here I'm showing you mitosis compared to meiosis to show you how they are similar. They look similar. See how they're here? They're tetrads. They are not tetrads in mitosis. They are tetrads in meiosis. They are not tetrads in mitosis. Over here, you start with 4, you end with 4. So they start diploid, they end diploid in mitosis. In meiosis, you start diploid, and after part 1, it ends haploid. Okay, and here's meiosis part 2. Meiosis part 2, it's a lot like mitosis, except you don't have 4 chromosomes, you only have 2. They line up single file, chromatids separate, and now you have 2 resulting cells with 2 chromosomes in each one. Now, in males, meiosis in males is called spermatogenesis. And what does it produce? One parent cell eventually leads to 4 sperm cells that are every one of them is haploid. Okay, this occurs in the testes in males. The testes are the male sex organs. In females, the female sex organs are called ovaries, and it starts with one parent cell, eventually leads to 4 cells. Okay, and what happens in these 4 cells is one of them only matures into a full egg. 3 of them form these polar bodies that get reabsorbed by the female's body. And these polar bodies, no, they are not eggs. They don't come to fruition. So what happens is one of them actually steals all the important stuff and takes all the important organelles and everything that are needed for the egg. And that one becomes the mature egg, the full haploid egg, where the 3 polar bodies, like I said, get broken down and reabsorbed. So in females, after meiosis in females, 1 egg forms and 3 polar bodies, where in males, 4 haploid sperm form. Okay, that's the big difference. And in females, it's called oogenesis. We are done with our lecture.